For every action, there is a reaction. It is theorized that each action and reaction creates a new timeline, dimension, universe, whatever you want to call it. Some of these new dimensions contain very minor changes, thus an infinite number of inconsequentially different timelines exist. However, an equally infinite number of timelines containing huge differences exist. Yet another equally infinite number of timelines were exactly the same as their neighbors since the beginning of time, until one seemingly small change occurred. The beginning of time being relative to the timeline in question, that is. The human we know as Frisk exists in many different timelines. The name applies to boys, girls, those in between, adults, kids, babies, monsters, humans. The possibilities are endless. This Frisk is very similar to one of his other counterparts. One small change, however, can make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. The human child's footsteps echoed as they traversed the final corridor of the core, towards the elevator which would allow them to finally leave Hotland and enter the king's castle, whereupon they would cross the barrier and leave the underground. Somehow. Frisk hadn't exactly worked out all the details yet, but just kind of winging it had worked wonders for them so far, so they were sure to find a way. They had to. The thought of approaching the king and asking him nicely to just let them through, as Papyrus suggested at the beginning of their journey, filled them with determination. Really, their biggest concern was Sans. At the end of their last run, Sans had not been helpful. What should have been their easiest challenge wound up being the challenge that cost them a full reset. It's not like Frisk didn't feel bad about the things they did, but at the time they felt like they had to do it. The first one was an accident. They didn't know their own strength, and Toriel paid for it dearly. Then there was that nagging voice in the back of their head. A voice that sounded like their own, yet somehow much, much colder. And older, as old as a child's voice can sound. It told them that, so long as Frisk did what the voice said, they would be fine. Frisk was told that Papyrus would betray him, so that's what he had to do. After all, in this world, it's kill or be killed, right? After that, things got easier. It became easier to kill once they weren't as emotionally attached. After the reset, as Frisk discovered, their newfound time-traveling ability required them to adhere to strict rules such as where and when he couldn't and could travel to. Frisk found that his actions had no consequences. So, he thought, let's just ignore that little voice in my head from now on. After all, what's the worst that could happen? If things went wrong, they could just reset again. Once he learned that, yes, Toriel could be saved, no, Papyrus was not a threat to him, and no, Monster Kid was not free XP, Frisk honestly felt a little bit stupid. They let the voice in their head control them, and he hated himself for it. Well, more so than he already did, but Frisk didn't like to think about what led him to Mount Ebott in the first place. So, yes, he was slightly apprehensive at meeting Sans in the Judgment Hall again. He remembered all too well the feeling of bone-tearing flesh and blaster-searing muscles. And that was when they were level 19. As Frisk had not killed anybody this time, they never gained any EXP, they never gained any love, and their HP remained at 20, where it was at the start of their adventure. He truthfully had no idea how he was going to deal with Sans, but he'd find a way. He had to. Still, though, he hoped that if he were destined to fight Sans, he'd go a bit easier on him this time. Maybe he can spare him since he knows he hasn't killed anyone, in this timeline at least. Man, was Frisk glad that Sans couldn't remember the previous timelines. When he left the ruins, he slipped up and greeted Sans before he told him to turn around, and even called him by name before his formal introduction. Sans didn't seem to think much of it, but Frisk knew better than to take chances with the pun-loving skeleton. He's been very careful ever since. Despite that, he was very receptive to the idea that perhaps Sans was destined to end his journey right here. At least, if he was going to die, he died knowing he hadn't let himself be lied to again. His entire second journey through the underground, Frisk didn't harm a soul. Never again will Frisk allow himself to be fooled by the likes of a tiny whining voice. It was at this point that Alphys, the Underground's royal scientist who had been helping him through Hotland, decided to speak up. Alphys followed him through the remainder of the core after Mettaton's batteries ran out, and hadn't spoken up until this point. So, she began with her usual stutter. You're about to meet Asgore, huh? Frisk simply nodded in response. You must be... She seemed like she was holding on to something she didn't want to say. Frisk stopped and turned to face her. You must be... Frisk tilted his head, confused. Pretty excited about all that, huh? You'll finally get to go home. Alphys was avoiding eye contact. Frisk thought that was weird, but he just chalked it up to Alphys being Alphys. No biggie. He kept walking. Alphys stopped again after a few feet, but Frisk didn't notice. Wait! Frisk turned around again, startled. Is something wrong, Alphys? Are you okay? Frisk asked, genuine concern for his new friend beginning to show. Fine, I just... She looked away. I was just going to, say goodbye, and... Alphys's eyelids lowered. She still refused to make eye contact with Frisk. Frisk scratched the back of his neck. First Toriel, and now Alphys. Was leaving the Underground really such a good idea? It seemed they were just hurting the same people they'd wanted to protect by leaving. When he left the ruins, Frisk simply chalked up Toriel's apprehension to the fact that she very probably thought he'd be killed once he left, as so many other human before him had. He didn't think for a moment that she actually just didn't want him to leave her behind. He wasn't used to being cared about. Now, here he was, with Alphys, who seemed equally saddened by the prospect of Frisk leaving the Underground. Frisk approached Alphys, who simply stared at her own feet. Hey, I still have this cell phone. I've been calling a couple of other friends with it for a while now. If you'd like to, once I'm on the surface, you can call me all you want. It'll be like I never left. Alphys didn't look comforted. Yeah, once you're on the surface. Listen, Alphys, I know it feels like I'm just up and leaving you, but, I can't stay here forever, Frisk reasoned. Oh, of course not, Alphys quickly responded. After all, you probably have family up there and stuff. Now it was Frisk's turn to avoid eye contact. Yeah, family. But that's not why I'm acting so funny. Oh? Human, I can't take this anymore. Alphys swallowed hard. Whatever she was about to tell him, Frisk could tell it was heavy. I lied to you. Frisk closed his eyes. Alphys, if this is about your role and the obstacles I've encountered thus far, I promise I'm not mad. If I'm being honest, Mettaton's antics were actually kind of fun, and I'm glad you were able to make yourself feel like a star. You're my friend, and... No, she interrupted. It's not that either. It's about the barrier. Her voice began to break. I told you, with your powerful soul, you could cross the barrier. I wasn't being entirely truthful. A human soul isn't strong enough to cross the barrier alone. Frisk studied her intently. His face was unchanging. So you're saying we've got to find another way across, right? Alphys sighed. It takes at least a human soul. Which I have. A human soul and... She swallowed again. And a monster soul. She looked back up at Frisk, whose determination levels dropped significantly upon hearing that. If you want to go home, no. You'll have to take his soul. You'll have to kill Asgore. I'm sorry. With that, Alphys turned to leave. Angry at nobody in particular, Frisk let out a groan and punched the wall, swearing under his breath once the pain shot through his arm. Shit! Startled, Alphys turned and looked at him again. Are you okay? I thought... Alphys looked like she could cry. I know, I should have told you sooner. Frisk fell to the floor, completely undetermined. I thought I had done everything right this time. Alphys tilted her head, confused. This time? Frisk brought his knees up to his body, resting his chin on them. Tears flowed freely from his eyes. I don't want to kill again. Alphys's eyes widened. Again? She had no idea that she'd been leading a murderer through Hotland. She could have sworn she saw him spare every monster in his way. Not that she was really watching at all times, but... Then she realized. The one fight she hadn't been watching. Undyne. This child in front of her had killed Undyne. The horrifying realization finally set in. You... killed Undyne? Frisk's eyes widened. He looked up at the reptilian above him. No, I didn't. Undyne is fine. She's with her friend Papyrus and Snowden right now. I haven't harmed anyone. Alphys sighed in relief, although she definitely would call Undyne after this to make sure Frisk was telling the truth. But she felt like she could trust him for some reason. So then, why did you say you... Frisk, realizing his slip-up, stood up. Nothing. I mean, I didn't. What I meant to say was, I don't want to kill Asgore. I'm going to go up that elevator, march through New Home, walk past the Judgment Hall, and... Alphys interrupted. Okay, now, hold on. There's a new bit of information. How do you know the layout of Asgore's castle? You've never been there before. This was as confused as Alphys had ever been. She knew for a fact this was the human's first time passing through Hotland. So how, then, did he seem to know exactly what was coming? Come to think of it, she added, you seem to know exactly where you were going after you came into the core. You knew what rooms to avoid, which path to take. You ignored my instructions like you knew the layout had changed. She's adding 2 and 2 together, said the voice in Frisk's head. You know what to do. Indeed, Frisk knew what to do. He stood up, sighing. Alphys came clean with him. It was time they came clean with her. That's not what I meant, the voice said, slightly disappointed. Frisk chuckled internally. In response, the voice blew imaginary raspberries. Alphys was a scientist. If anybody needed to know about this strange ability, it was her. He just hoped she wouldn't think they were totally crazy. Alphys, Frisk began, I haven't been entirely truthful with you either. He then explained the power to her, leaving out most of the murdery details. What it does, what he can do with it, its limitations. Alphys's eyes were wide the entire time. When he finished explaining it, she looked like he'd grown 2 or 3 heads in front of her. Time travel? She asked for clarification. Frisk nodded. That's... Alphys's dorky grin from earlier returned in full force. That's amazing! It's just like this anime I watch about this girl who's stuck in a time loop and they keep reliving the same day and she has to find a way to stop an alien invasion before the end of the day, and there's this guy she likes and she uses the loop to learn lots about him. And she's in a band! But because of the alien invasion, she never gets anything done before the Earth explodes, but one day she finds one of their agents and whoops, I almost spoiled a big twist where her love interest is working with the... Alphys! Frisk snapped her out of it. Focus. Alphys blushed slightly. Right. So, you've killed Asgore before? Frisk shook his head. No, I didn't get to his throne room the first time. Alphys frowned. So then, who... Frisk's face grew sad. I guess she has to learn the other thing too, he thought. It wasn't a matter of who did Frisk kill. It was a matter of who didn't he kill. Before he could answer, however, Alphys shook her head. I guess it doesn't really matter. Whoever it was, you clearly felt bad enough about it to do things over? Frisk nodded. So, you're sure there's no way to get past the barrier? Alphys shook her head. No. A being can only cross the barrier if they possess both a human and a monster soul. The barrier can be broken with the use of 7 human souls, but I would have to die. Exactly. So, why haven't you killed me then? Alphys's eyes widened. What are you... I mean, if you killed me, you could bring my soul to Asgore. He becomes a god and breaks the barrier, and the surface is taken back from humanity. All of your problems are very easily solved with my death. Alphys searched for the right answer. I don't know, she admitted finally. It was true. Frisk's continued existence was an obstacle that kept the monsters underground, and yet she couldn't bring herself to think of him like that. Frisk was her friend, not a hurdle to be jumped over. More silence. Frisk knew what to do. Deep down, they knew it was the right thing to do. If Sans was going to kill them in the next room anyway, then... Frisk looked up at Alphys. I won't fight Asgore. Alphys breathed a sigh of relief. Kid, you have no idea how happy I am to hear you say that. I know it's not your home, but the underground isn't so bad once you get used to it. If you'd like, you can stay at my lab if you don't have any other place to stay, although... I'm not staying here either. What? What? The voice asked. Frisk definitely knew what he had to do. He had to do the right thing. He had to do what was best for everyone around him, even if it wasn't in his own best interests. I'm going to let Asgore take my soul. He looked Alphys in the eyes. You're going to be free. With that, Frisk entered the elevator. As the doors were closing, Alphys wedged her foot in them, preventing the elevator from leaving. Hang on! You can't be serious, she exclaimed. You can't just tell me what you just told me and expect me to forget about it and go back to my lab like I didn't hear anything. Well, that's awkward, because that's exactly what I'm expecting you to do, replied Frisk. Alphys rolled her eyes. Clearly, this human had been hanging out with Sans. Alphys briefly wondered what he was doing these days, before snapping out of it and turning her attention back to the human in front of her. I can't let you go up there. Alphys had made up her mind. She was going to take the human back to her lab, by force if necessary. Then call Undyne and figure out what to do about this situation. Assertive, replied Frisk in a somewhat colder voice. You really think you can keep me here? Alphys took a step back, careful to leave her right foot wedged in the door. She could have sworn she saw a red glint in the human's normally green eyes, but as soon as he blinked, the human shook his head and seemed to have returned to normal. Sorry. That was rude of me, the child responded. Child? Alphys wasn't sure. He looked to be about 12 or 13, but the tone he took up just now sounded like someone who was much older and much, much more tired. In any case, mental age aside, he was physically too young to be going on a suicide mission. Alphys crossed her arms. You're coming back to my lab. Normally, Alphys would have backed down ages ago, but she couldn't afford to this time. A child's life was on the line. The king had killed 6. Alphys was going to save 1 and any others that came after him. The scientist was only 23 years old, and already she'd ruined enough lives to last a lifetime. She was going to make up for that, starting now. Frisk shook his head. This is something I have to do. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Alphys was annoyed now. If you go up there and hand your soul to Asgore, we're going to war. Do you understand that? It's not just your life on the line here. His life was her primary concern, but she wasn't about to tell him that. If you die here, you'll be the first of millions. The human looked surprised. He hadn't thought of that. Good. She was swaying them. Tell me, human, what's the closest city once you leave the mountain? That'd be Denver. And how many people live in Denver? The human looked like they had to think about it. I don't know. 500,000? It's not a very big city. Alphys' eyes widened. Whoa, wait. 500,000 isn't big? Just how many humans are up there, and what's a big city like? There are around 7 billion people on Earth. About 5 million live in Colorado, the state where Mount Ebott is located. 3 million live in the metropolitan area immediately surrounding Denver, and a big city like New York has around 8 million people, the human explained. 7 billion humans? Alphys' mind was racing. She truthfully had no idea the planet could even hold that many people, and the underground only had a few thousand monsters. Well, if you give Asgore your soul, you can consider Denver's entire population obliterated in a day. Colorado in a week, the world in mere months. That's how powerful he would become. I can't say we don't have it coming, Frisk replied dryly, but you're right. It certainly would be a shame if my death were the first of billions. Satisfied, Alphys nodded. I'm glad you see it my way, human. Suddenly, the human pushed Alphys out of the elevator, and the doors began to close. "Which is why I'm going to talk things out with the king. Then I'll give him my soul. Nice chatting with you, Alphys." Before she could react, the door slid shut and the elevator moved upwards. No, 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 no! Alphys frantically tried calling the elevator down, to no avail. It was too late. The human was well on his way to new home. Alphys was all alone. Alphys failed once again. The human was going to face Asgore, and only one will leave the throne room. And she never got to ask him more about time travel. "Please, human," the reptilian said to nobody in particular. "Come to your senses." She started down the hallway. "Please come back." She dragged Mettaton's lifeless body, only in need of recharging, thank God, across the floor. "Please stay in the underground with me and Undyne and Mettaton and those skeletons in Snowdin." She entered the elevator, which took her to the core's entrance. "And if you don't..." She left the MTT resort, still dragging its owner. "If you must fight Asgore." Alphys walked into her lab, pulled out a pair of AA batteries, which provided a surprising amount of energy to the robot. Efficiency at its finest. Kill him. It's better than the alternative. Somehow, though, Alphys knew the human wouldn't be doing any killing. Not again. It was only then that she realized that she was back at the entrance to her lab, tugging Mettaton. What? I could have sworn I was just upstairs. Alphys knew what this meant. The human was messing with time again. He had died, likely in the battle with Asgore, and for some reason decided to live just a little bit longer. He knew something she didn't. Perhaps it was something she did know until just a few seconds ago. She wasn't sure exactly how severely her memories were being affected by the reset. Alphys walked into her lab. She grinned. In a few moments, she might not remember grinning. Hell, she might not even remember that the human can time travel. But in this moment, she knew the human had a plan. Somehow, she knew that nobody was dying today. Alphys walked into her lab for what felt like the 5th or 6th time. She couldn't remember what she was so happy about just now, but she had hope it was for a good reason. She changed Mettaton's batteries and sat down at her computer. Alphys walked into her lab. Her memory was hazy, but she tried her best to hold on. Something about the human could time travel. She remembered that much. That must be what's happening. Alphys walked into her lab. Deja vu, she thought as she changed Mettaton's batteries. Was I just here? She couldn't trust her memories lately. Alphys walked into her lab. The human hates me. I'm sure of it. Alphys walked into her lab. She said nothing as she changed Mettaton's batteries before heading to her computer and sitting down in front of it. After what must have been an hour, there was a knock at her door, and a letter slid underneath. Alphys hated letters.